Bild, Bildung, and the Romance of the Soul. Reflections upon the Image of Meister Eckhart by Douglas Hedley. Why should we be thinking about the relation of ethics in education? A key here is the revival of essentially metaphysical questions about the foundations of ethics. Much hangs on whether one offers subjective or objective accounts of ethics and aesthetics. In the last few years, there has been a remarkable revival of metaphysical positions that would have seemed outlandish a couple of decades ago. One might think of the problems that have attended reflecting upon the phenomenon of consciousness as mere brain function. Hence, panpsychism has been emerging out of philosophy of mind in philosophers like Galen Strawson. Or one might consider the appeal to teleology in Thomas Nagel, and his claim that self-conscious, intelligent awareness of reality and the kinship between mind and world that is presupposed by science should not be swept under the carpet on the neo-Darwinian grounds that it is an evolutionary accident. There has been a striking reemergence of realism in ethics. In this context, we can happily revisit the old problem of, as Kierkegaard puts it, the relation between aesthetics, morality, and religion. In this connection, I wish to consider a Bild, or image, employed by the great heathen Platonist Plotinus, and then used by one of his Christian followers, Meister Eckhart. That wonder, which is the beginning of true philosophy, is ignited and fostered, as Plato says quite correctly, by the sense of the astonishing and gratuitous beauty of the world. It is this eros that fuels the longing for truth, though it is not always clear where it may lead. If I might offer a personal example, let us take the experience of evensong at a Cambridge college or a cathedral. I have noted in my own college that many of those who attend such a liturgy of sacred music are not conventionally Christian or religious, and yet it seems that the beauty and dignity of the service addresses a deep need to contemplate the sacred order. The language of contemplation is important here as a means of expressing the religious or otherworldly dimension of ethics. This dimension should be distinguished from a reductionist or functional conception of ethics in which morality is essentially a description of human flourishing. Goodness, or the form of the good in the Platonic tradition, is opposed to instrumental or functionalist theories of value. The arts and the theoretical sciences have a singular capacity to inspire a non-attached appreciation of the beauty of the world, and a love of it that has little to do with personal aggrandizement or gain, but rather with an image of goodness for its own sake. As Simone Weil and T.S. Eliot so eloquently assured us, that contemplation should not be rent asunder from history, or indeed from the cultural particularities of the tribe. History and tradition can serve to summon the spirit to contemplate that which transcends any given breed or culture. A rootless population is more likely to be captivated and caught up by proximate goods and ephemeral interests. In this respect, what Goethe said of the child, "Give the child roots and wings," applies equally to nations. Our own Western philosophical tradition is rooted in the Greeks, who were fascinated by the nature of contemplation and by purely disinterested knowledge for its own sake. They developed an imposing body of epistemic questions about pure knowledge of the world, which is unrelated to any proximate goals or advantages. As Aristotle insisted, human minds possess a desire to know which is rather different from a merely adaptive intelligence. Yet contemplation was, for the Greeks, more than an index of the strange capacity of humans for disinterested knowledge. It was an expression of the human longing for true happiness. Western metaphysics begins with an arresting soteriological image, Plato's cave. In Plato's dramatic representation in the Republic, 514a to 520a, Socrates imagines prisoners sitting in a cave from childhood, with their limbs and heads chained and only able to look straight ahead. However, behind them is a big fire that projects light onto the wall of the cave. A wall runs between the fire and the prisoners. Behind this wall there are people carrying statues of humans and animals and other things. The prisoners see shadows of objects which project above the wall passing in front of the fire behind them, but they do not see the shadows of the people carrying the objects aloft, since they are hidden by the wall. According to this simile, the life of a philosopher is a turning or conversion from this enforced bondage toward the light of the fire, followed by the ascent from the depths of the cave, emergence into the outer world, and eventual contemplation of the sun. Having recognized the distinction between the light of the sun and the light of the fire, the philosopher can return to help the cave dwellers, who in ignorance assume that the shadows produced by the fire are reality. The imagery of the cave is inherently opposed to a mechanistic view of the mind as an instrument and education as a mode of causality, as seen, for example, in Hume's project of tracing ideas to impressions, or in Russell's reduction of ideas to sense data. David Hume presents Locke at the forefront of the application of experimental philosophy to moral subjects. Voltaire also, with his characteristic brio, views Locke as a stage in the process of moving from the exploded prerogative of metaphysics and its special privileges towards a properly empirical science of human nature. Such a multitude of reasoners having written the romance of the soul, a sage at last rose who gave, with an air of the greatest modesty, the history of it. Mr. Locke has displayed the human soul in the same manner as an excellent anatomist explains the springs of the human body. He everywhere takes the light of physics for his guide. Locke's modest use of the light of physics is contrasted favorably by Voltaire with the romance of the soul, of which the Platonic version constitutes a paradigm. Whether Voltaire or Hume were correct to see Locke as a radical Baconian is irrelevant for our current purposes. Locke stands for a great shift in Western thought in the 17th century, one in which experimental method is employed as a measure of mind and value, and is the harbinger of the widespread scientism in philosophy of the last 100 years, especially in the English-speaking world, and the closely related tendency to view teaching as the administration of skills and facts. The German theologian, visionary, and mystic Meister Eckhart, 1260 to circa 1328, a Dominican monk and prior in Erfurt, whose teachings were in part condemned by the Roman Catholic Church, was, unlike Locke, Hume, or Voltaire, a professional teacher. His Romance of the Soul is an excellent instance of the relation between the idea of the privileged status of subjectivity and the problem of ethics and education. His use of the sermon as a device to present some of his deepest metaphysical convictions is at one with his conviction that ethics, metaphysics, and education belong together. Moreover, he plays a pivotal role in the development of the German language of the Bild and the entire complex of ideas inherited from Plato, including reflection regarding the relationship of image and archetype. At the origins of Western philosophy is the notion of philosophy as contemplating the true, as opposed to merely apparent nature of reality. In Plato, the association of the supposed facts of everyday experience with the real world is imaginatively subverted through the ingenious thought experiment of the analogy of the cave. Hence, the critical deployment of imagination is a key aspect of philosophical activity in Plato. It is in this context that the role of Plato's myths is to be understood, keeping in mind the contrast between the classifications and images of the finite mind on the one hand and the notion that higher contemplative thought is a mirror, i.e. speculum, of ultimate reality on the other. For the Platonist, one must not mistake the image for the archetype. The mind is not a tabula rasa, but requires freeing from its bondage to ignorance and error. To know, in the Platonic sense, is thus not to acquire a skill, but to engage in a process of transformation. Eckhart follows Platonist thought in this respect. Knowledge is inextricably linked to education, or Bildung, whereby Bildung has this specific sense. The relationship of the German word Bild and its cognate Bildung, as well as related forms like ent-bilden, for example, of the eternal word in the soul, ent-bilden, that is, of the soul in the eternal word, ent-bilden, i.e. release from false images of the self, unter-bilden, of the self's image by means of God's eternity, is hereby most instructive. For Eckhart, the whole point of his theory of Bild is the dynamic dimension of Bildung, the shaping of the self that emerges from the recognition of its true identity and vocation. Education, in its proper sense, is to lead out of, educere. To begin the process of knowledge, one must turn not, as the empiricist claims, without, but within. A machine is moved by external push and shove. A spiritual being can be moved by the internal ought, the fact of goodness, by what another, more modern anti-naturalist calls pure practical reason. Put in very simple terms, the point of education is the realization of value rather than the acquisition of facts. For many ethicists, the moral quality of an act depends not upon the act per se, but the effect of the act upon others or the environment. The value of an action is a function of the consequences or the impact of the action, as in aesthetics, where the view is widespread that aesthetic value resides in the beholder, listener, or reader, the experience of an agent encountering an object of art or an item of natural beauty, such as a mountain or a waterfall. For much of the last century, such subjective and instrumental accounts of value seem deliberation, from the exploded tenet that values are embedded in certain facts, or the fantastical conviction that these values may be absolute, immutable, and eternal. Such philosophical accounts of the objectivity of beauty and moral value were often presented by influential thinkers of the last century as obsolete relics of a bygone metaphysical age, or even the atavistic longing for the suppression of individual liberty and expression, Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies, and so on. Or the postmodern variations on the theme derived from the French admirers of Heidegger. Modern philosophers as diverse as Gilbert Ryle or Martin Heidegger viewed Platonic contemplation as the unfortunate offspring of fairly natural but philosophically disastrous errors. First and foremost, the Greek facility for combining the definite article with participles or neuter adjectives was seen as encouraging the tendency to hypostatize. That is, to view abstract terms as names of real things. Ryle and Heidegger both diagnosed one of the causes of this inclination as the propensity to muddle knowing with seeing. The Greek verb to see, oran, namely, has the spiritual or intellectual connotation of vision, and the words used by Plato for idea, i.e. eidos, or more seldom idea, are linked to the aorist form of oran, idein. The point of turning within and contemplation in Platonist metaphysics and its successors like Meister Eckhart is not, however, a theoretical preoccupation with a falsely objectified, verdinglicht, dynamic being. In Ennead 1:6, Plotinus writes, "Shut your eyes and change to and wake another way of seeing, which everyone has but few use. And what does this inner sight see? When it is just awakened, it is not at all able to look at the brilliance before it, so that the soul must be trained, first of all, to look at beautiful works, not those which the arts produce, but the works of men who have a name for goodness. Then look at the souls of the people who produce the beautiful works. How, then, can you see the sort of beauty a good soul has? Go back into yourself and look. And if you do not yet see yourself as beautiful, then just as someone making a statue which has to be beautiful cuts away here, and polishes there, and makes one part smooth, and clears another till he has given his statue a beautiful face, so too you must cut away excess, and straighten the crooked, and clear the dark, and make it bright, and never stop working on your statue, till the divine glory of virtue shines out on you, till you see self-mastery enthroned upon its holy seat." The treatise is concerned with the nature of beauty and its relationship to goodness. Note that Plotinus insists that the soul must be habituated through beautiful works. He means, however, not the fine arts, but good actions. The aesthetic is nevertheless employed as the model of ethical improvement. Moral improvement is presented as a process of increasing likeness to an ideal form. To become better morally is compared to the work of a sculptor fashioning, cutting, and polishing a statue. Clearly, the process of formation, or Bildung, is envisaged as accommodation to a transcendent standard of value and truth. This can be contrasted with the widespread reduction of knowing that to knowing how, in Gilbert Ryle or in Heidegger's critique of Vorhandenheit in the history of metaphysics to the advantage of Zuhandenheit, both instances of reducing the theoretical to the practical. Such moves do insufficient justice to the question of truth. As Plato insists in his distinction between philosophy and rhetoric, knowledge of any kind presupposes the judicious and correct employment of standards. Within Plato, the forms furnish such standards. Whatever the status of the theory of forms, Plato's general point still stands. Practice must be the product of theory if you want to distinguish between good and bad instances. In the Platonic model of ethics, which we find in Plotinus and Eckhart, there is a movement outside the self towards the principle of an absolute goodness, an eternal and immutable measure of right and wrong. Yet this movement outside the self is also a process of self-discovery. The contemplation required is contemplation of the self, and the recognition of the true self in relation to goodness. What is this goodness? In various works, especially the Republic, Plato offers some considerations about what goodness is not. It is not pleasure. Plato's critique of hedonism is familiar. The Phaedo, 83b 5-7, states that the philosopher should keep away from pleasures and appetites. The psychology of the Republic works on the principle that some desires are irrational and require control by reason, and the Timaeus 69d1 presents pleasure as evil's greatest bait. Nor is goodness to be identified with getting more in the sense of an increase in power or consumption, pleonexia. Finally, goodness in the strong Platonic sense should not be confused with conventional morality. One might think of Glaucon's tale of the Ring of Gyges in Book 2 of the Republic, 359a to 360d. The story is employed to attack Glaucon's view of justice as a matter of compromise and expedience. Socrates claims in Republic 10, 612b, that the soul should be just whether it possesses the Ring of Gyges or not. Eckhart's distinctive theme in his sermons of living without a why, ohne Warum or Sünder Warum, belongs to this philosophical context. The ethical model is contemplative and resolutely anti-instrumental. Goodness is not to be confused with the pursuing of a range of specific limited ends, such as pleasure, recognition, or esteem, but consists in recognition of an absolute value. To be good is to become an image, or Bilde, of that supreme goodness that is the standard of finite goods. In Sermon 53, Meister Eckhart writes about detachment or cutting away as the central theme of his sermons. When I preach, I am accustomed to speak about detachment, and that man should be free of himself and of all things. Second, that a man should be formed again into that simple good which is God. Third, that he should reflect on the great nobility with which God has endowed his soul, so that, in this way, he may come to wonder at God. Fourth, about the purity of the divine nature, for the brightness of the divine nature is beyond words. Here we find the core of Eckhart's ethics, the themes of detachment, cutting away or letting go as the release from everyday involvements in the world, and then being formed again or reformed. Alongside the ideas of detachment and conversion to the supreme good is the notion of the nobility and purity of the divine nature, and recognition of the intrinsic dignity of the true self as an image of its transcendent source. The noun denoting emptiness or nudity of the soul, Middle High German Lüterkeit, German Reinheit, English purity, and the adjectives Lüter, rein, pure, ledig, frei, unbehindert, free, unfettered, entblößt, nackt, unverhüllt, entblößt, naked, unconcealed, denuded, are important terms for the purity of the essential self as bare, pure, and single. The soul, in this state, imagines the God who is beyond all images. The model of the self employed here is that of the Bild, or imago, of the divine. At one level, it is a conventional and ubiquitous theme of ancient and medieval thought. The manner in which Eckhart deploys the topos, however, reveals his audacious and unconventional spirit. The key text from Genesis 1:26, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness," was paradigmatic for the so-called Imago Dei doctrine, as was the designation of Christ in Colossians 1:15, who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature. The image motif was used for both anthropology and Christology, and Eckhart often moves between the Christological Imago Patris and the anthropological Imago Dei. The philosophical tradition of image and archetype, with its roots in Alcibiades 1:133c, in Augustine's reflections on the themes in De Trinitate, and Thomas's in the first part of Summa Theologiae, Quaestio 35 and Quaestio 93, formed the basis for Eckhart's Bild, imago speculation. Eckhart intensifies this tradition of speculation on the Imago Dei, probably under the influence of Dietrich of Freiburg and his development of the theory of the intellectus agens in relation to the Imago Dei. The procedere ut imago, or the procession as image, or formal emanation, is distinguished from efficient or final causality as the truly metaphysical mode. This, along with the reditio completa, or the complete return, is characteristic of the intellect as image. The nature of thought, thinking itself, which stems from Aristotle but whose fundamental features may be traced to Parmenides' identity of being and thought, can best be conceived of as procedere ut imago, or the procession as image. The technical term for this was formal emanation, to express the movement from the archetype to its ectype, and the return from the latter to the former. The central idea is that of desubstantializing or de-reifying spiritual or immaterial relations. Unlike efficient causal relations between two material objects, say billiard balls, the relation between the mind and its objects is one of a relative identity between the thinker and its thoughts. The two billiard balls are two tokens of a type, but they are distinct as objects in a way that spiritual items, i.e. mind and its thoughts, cannot be. The image and its exemplar are not two separate substances, but inextricably related to each other. A further example is found in Eckhart's Sermon 16, where he compares physical and spiritual vessels. Spiritual vessels, he insists, are not distinct from what they contain. Wine is inside the vessel. The vessel is not in the wine, nor is the wine in the vessel in the sense that it is inside the boards. If it were in the vessel, in this sense one could not drink it. It is different with a spiritual vessel. Everything that is taken into it is in the vessel, and the vessel is in it, and it is the vessel itself. Everything that the spiritual vessel takes in has the same nature as the vessel. It is God's nature that he gives himself to every good soul, and it is the nature of the soul that it takes God in. It is not flat-footed pantheism to say with the great Thuringian master that the eye with which I see God is the same with which God sees me. My eye and God's eye is one eye and one sight and one knowledge and one love. It is indeed no accident that Hegel should quote Eckhart on this point when he is critiquing a false transcendence. The image is, properly speaking, a simple emanation transfused with the whole essence pure and naked. Imago proprie est emanatio simplex, formalis transfusiva totius essentiae pure nude. The significance of this for moral theory is the following. If we are made in the image of God, we can consider the ethical subspecie aeternitatis in a manner satisfying Augustine's insistence in Book 7 of his Confessions that nothing finite can satisfy the yearning for the divine being. The soul is satisfied only in transcending all finite images toward the imago of the imageless Father. Eckhart's use of terms such as transformatio or transfiguratio belong, in this sense, to a soteriological theory of divinization. The strongly metaphysical terminology should not thereby obscure the fact that justification and sanctification belong together. For Eckhart, the adoption of grace alone enables the soul to become that which the Son is by nature. Eckhart, in this vein, adopts the Plotinian image of the sculptor and of the cutting away Abgeschiedenheit, which is implicit in its key terminology. I have sometimes presented another clear analogy. When a master sculpts a figure from wood or stone, he does not place the figure in the wood, but cuts away the sections that cover and conceal it. He gives the wood nothing, but rather takes from it, cutting away the overlay, scraping off the rust, and then polishing what lay hidden beneath. This is the treasure which lay hidden in the field, as our Lord says in the Gospel, Matthew 13:44. St. Augustine says that when the human soul is turned fully upwards, towards eternity, towards God alone, then the image of God shines brightly. But when the human soul is turned outwards, even towards the practice of external virtues, this image is completely hidden. The dialectic of ent-bilden and überbilden rests upon Eckhart's deployment of Avicenna's, Aristotle's, and Alfarabi's metaphysics of intellect, albeit in a profoundly Christian form. Much is written in the scholarship about whether Eckhart is mystical or fundamentally philosophical in orientation. However, the opposition itself is rather misleading. Eckhart is, in one sense, radically originistic, because for him Scripture itself is the very culmination of metaphysical truth, which is why he can assert that John's Gospel is the science of being qua being. The theory of the intellect as image that Eckhart derived via Albert and Dietrich was nevertheless a metaphysics of the verbum, the birth in the soul of the Son, and the birth of the soul in God. The incarnational focus and the focus on the dwelling of the incarnate Word, intellect, in the humble soul, means that this is a theology of grace in which the intellect is potentially all things, while itself nothing. Only God, for Eckhart, has this intrinsic indistinction. What is the point of this reflection on the image and the source beyond all images? My claim, as based on Meister Eckhart's theory of Bildung, is that contemplation properly precedes praxis. One has to contemplate one's own real self before one can act appropriately in the world. In Ennead 1:2, on virtues, Plotinus reflects upon the theme of becoming like God in Plato's Theaetetus 176a, and how that concept can be reconciled with Aristotle's theory of virtue. Plotinus adroitly combines the Aristotelian concept of the virtues and the Platonic, Stoic ideal of God-likeness by distinguishing between higher and lower kinds of virtues. He explores the themes of catharsis and conversion with a distinction between higher, purificatory or cathartic virtues and lower civic virtues. Practical wisdom of the kind required for the harmonious life of the city is thereby subordinated to the pursuit of goodness itself, as a process of continuing purification and turning within. Ethics must not be confused, then, with the measuring of outward data, predicting actions, or modeling patterns of behavior. When contemplation precedes praxis, ethics becomes a form of vision. Yet such contemplation is, of course, no substitute for praxis. The concept of Bilde is a dynamic notion for Eckhart, and linked to various dynamic cognates, for example, ent-bilden and überbilden, all of which reinforce the practical urgency of the doctrine. The Pauline, Neoplatonic metaphysics of the image which we find at the heart of Eckhart's ethics might be inadequately conveyed by saying that form, information, and transformation must be held together. The great and eloquent Cambridge Platonist John Smith, 1618 to 1652, was a true successor of Eckhart when he identified goodness as inwardness, yet not in some version of Locke's rather abstract inner sense, but as the education of the real self. There is an inward beauty, life, and loveliness in divine truth, which cannot be known but only then when it is digested into life and practice. Divine truth is better understood as it unfolds itself in the purity of men's hearts and lives than in all those subtle niceties into which curious wits may lay it forth. And therefore our Saviour would not lay it out to us in any canons or articles of belief, not being indeed so careful to stock and enrich the world with opinions and notions as with true piety, and a godlike pattern of purity as the best way to thrive in all spiritual understanding. That inward beauty and godlike pattern of purity of the soul transformed by its exemplar is the image realized in life and practice.